The American Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 12.
I am Ellen Roseman Curtis. I am from the San Francisco area, and I am an adoption facilitator working in what is called cooperative adoption placement from Japan to Europe. I represent people who are married, people who are single, people who are gay. The title of the workshop today is Why Open Adoption Isn't Enough: Entitlement versus Ownership of the Adoptee. When I first became interested in this particular topic, I called Sharon Kaplan and asked her if anyone had ever done an entire workshop on the topic of ownership versus entitlement, and she said no. She thought it was too esoteric. So I began, and this was 3 years ago. In 1980, my husband and I adopted 2 babies that were 10 weeks apart in age. We went to a San Francisco facilitator, and like many others, we sent out a mass mailing of letters. We were well-educated people, but basically we knew nothing about the adoption process. Our adoptions were closed. We had some information about the birth parents. And when one of our daughters was 10 weeks of age, her birth parents asked our attorney if they could see us to know that the child had been well placed. We were scared. I didn't understand why they needed to do this, but we decided to go ahead, and rather than meet them at a midway point, we asked them to come to our home. And for me, this was the beginning of a wonderful journey. When I opened the door and looked at my daughter's birth mother, I looked down and I could see underneath her skirt that her knees were shaking. And I also could see that she leaned over towards the birth father, who was trying to support her. As I looked at myself, I realized that my own knees were shaking and that this was a very scary experience for all of us. We had no education and we were winging it. So we invited them in. We went from room to room saying, this is a bedroom, this is a bathroom. Finally, my husband realized that there was insanity in all of this, and he opened a bottle of good California wine. And from there, the day progressed. And I want you to know it was the most wonderful experience that I can remember. And that was the beginning of for me, to start thinking about the open adoption process. I think we've come apart here. Thank you. How did you know that happened? Okay. Thank you. After that, I began to facilitate as a hobby, helping others who wanted to build a family through adoption. And the focus was only to help others find a child. There was no focus on education. There was no focus on anything, open or closed. It was simply find a child in any way that worked for you. As I began to work with people like Sharon Kaplan and do some reading, I began to see that there was a difference. And as adoptions were at that time starting to move into an open nature, this felt good to me. This felt like it was the right way to go. And each year I found that the adoptions were becoming more and more open. Finally, I realized that there were different kinds of open adoptions. And I began to differentiate between what I call the business open adoption, which was described this meeting in the general session, and the open, loving, caring type of adoption. I also began to see that there was a difference in the adoptive families who were involved in these adoptions. The families involved in the business open adoptions did indeed have a lot of savvy. And the adoptions were in the head. They were not in the heart. These were not people who developed empathy for the birth family. And I later was able to learn that these were not people who developed empathy for their children. And this is a key piece that took me further into the journey. I then moved into full open disclosure on all adoptions, and eventually moved into the cooperative adoptions, because I was seeing that these were working for everyone involved in the process. As the journey continued and I was a member of Resolve, I was looking at the issue of grief and the fact that adoptive families who did not do any grief work around this particular issue were not good candidates for open adoption. And so I would like to say to you that a basic building block for anybody who chooses to adopt must be some resolution, some work around the grieving, the grief issues. The next thing I began to observe was that families who were moving into visitation with the birth parents seemed to feel different to me. They had a sense of confidence. There was something that I wasn't seeing in the other families. So as I was doing the reading, I realized that there were two articles or two pieces out on entitlement. And if anyone knows of anything else, please raise your hand and share it with all of us. In Lois Molina's first book on raising adopted children, she has a small section where she defines entitlement. And she says that it's developing a sense that the child belongs in the family even though she wasn't born into it, is a crucial task for adoptive parents. Unless parents develop a sense that the child is really theirs, they will have difficulty accepting their right to act as parents. And she suggests that the amount of entitlement parents feel can be determined by looking at the extent to which they take risks, deal with separation, handle discipline, and discuss adoption not only with the child but with others. Later, I was reading Patricia Pat Johnston and was able to see that in her book, An Adopter's Advocate, that she had one chapter on entitlement. As I was working with various agencies, I began to realize that nobody was really talking about this, and nobody really knew how to teach it or how to work with it. But what we did know was that most adoptive parents were not working with this particular concept. And some of the ways that we knew this would be if an adoptee were to come forth and say to the parent, I want to do a search, they would find the parent or parents dissolved in tears. They might say something such as, if you do a search, if my child does a search and finds a birth family, I will only have been a babysitter for 22 years. This is an entitlement issue. So I was beginning to put the pieces together. And then a client of mine who was in the justice system in Phoenix mentioned something, and she said, you know, I'm an attorney, Ellen, And I notice that adoptive families are different when they come in, which they often do to face a judge. She said, I notice that a family who's bringing in a child by birth will say, my child didn't do this, to the judge. And that they might argue and that they would be very strong and forceful, almost proud in talking about their child. She said, you know, adoptive families are different. And I said, well, how? She said, well, they kind of shuffle. And they might mumble. And they will always say, you know, my child's adopted. She said, I think the word I'm looking for is shame when I see these people in the courtroom. So this was another piece for me to think about as I was doing this work and as I was evolving. Then I was talking to Annette Barron some more one day, and Annette was complaining again about the number of people going into open adoption without some of the basic building blocks. And she said, you know, we're seeing them come back now, and they're having a lot of problems in the family. So we began to talk about this, and again to ask, how can you teach entitlement to a family? And if you have a choice between open and closed adoption or developing a sense of entitlement, which do you think might be more important? And we have some wonderful professionals in here, and I'd like to ask a couple of them if you have a thought on this. Given a choice of open or closed or entitlement, do you have any thoughts? Jim Gritter?
Well, can you define the dilemma again here? Or what?
Okay, you have a family and you're going to work with them. And if, say the family's going to be, they have a choice of doing a closed adoption with entitlement or an open adoption without the entitlement work, do you have a feeling as to what piece you would go for first?
Well, you know, the conundrum is mistakenly drawn, is actually the way I react to that. Because hopefully open adoption, in its very fundamental, most basic concepts, would include entitlement. And I think entitlement is really improves through open adoption. But I'll still take a shot at it.
Okay. I agree that open adoption should be improved through entitlement,
Well,
or the other way.
From the perspective of what's good for the child, you know, the entitlement piece will prevail probably.
Okay. Ray, would you agree with what Jim said from the perspective of the child?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Okay. That's been my experience as well. And that is that if I were to be involved in a closed adoption, and I am right now, in which a birth father is violent and in jail, and it's an agency in Montana, the entitlement issue is the key piece that I am looking at in terms of what the adoptive family is going to need to have. So the question I have first is, how do you work with a family to develop it? And in my experience, what I do is just put it right out there. And sometimes I do it with a little grenade and sometimes with a big grenade. And so I find that by giving a family examples, they are then able to incorporate it and to work with it. Now, I'm normally not involved in closed adoptions. I may see one every 2 or 3 years at most. Families that I work with that are going into open adoptions are required to do masses of reading. The requirement is that they be members of Resolve. So we're looking at the basic building block, the grief issues, And once they have done some of the basic work, then the entitlement work is how do you feel about the birth family? What comes up when you think about parenting in terms of ownership? And when I think of ownership, I think of landowners, I think of possessing, a master, and I think of control. And one of the things I've heard at the conference so far is the word control. So much control in the adoption process. Entitlement to me brings forth the terms claiming behavior, self-confidence, qualified, fit for parent, fit for parenting, unconditional love, bonding, and attachment. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So what I find is that by giving people examples, they are then able to play with it effectively. And by having birth parents who are a part of your life, who are coming to visit in many cases, that then the family is able to feel the feelings and when they come up, effectively deal with them. Now, I have had families say to me, we want a nice cooperative adoption, and we would like the birth family to visit, but not until we've bonded and attached. And so maybe when the baby is 4 to 6 months old, we would like a visit. And I will say to them, does that mean that you are having nobody visit you for the first 4 months? And they will say, well, of course not, Ellen. My mother will be coming, and our neighbors will be coming, and my sister will be visiting. That is always a key issue around entitlement, that if you feel entitled to parent, you do not exclude the birth family, that you are able to incorporate them comfortably into your life as you would any extended family member. Are there any questions about that particular piece? Ellen?
I have a question. I was just going to add another source that I found that had some information.
Sure. This is Ellen Wieselman. She's a facilitator from Illinois.
You are our child, Smith and Miroff.
That is correct.
Section on
Yes. Thank you. And I believe that book is carried by Parenting Resources at the conference. Okay. The other yes.
You said that the birth father is now in prison?
In this particular case, he will be out. He gets out. He's in a jail, and he gets out periodically. And when he does, he goes and harasses and tears up the birth mother. He is very violent, and she has not done very much about it. So she has authorized the agency to do a closed adoption, to maintain full records for this entire situation. The little girl in question is now 2 years of age and has been in foster care for 2 years while this has gone on and on and on.
But this isn't your baby's birth father, no?
No, it's not. No, this is a situation that I've facilitated for an agency.
But supposing it was, would you want him coming around your home all the time?
No, but this is a closed adoption.
No, but aren't you advocating, isn't that basically what you're advocating, or are you advocating that in all cases that parents allow the birth parents to come?
No, I'm not advocating full visitation. What I advocate is good common sense. And I think that's what everybody doing this work is advocating. And that if you have someone who is violent, very, very dysfunctional, you're not going to have the normal contact. Yes?
So if you don't have that, and being a social worker in a public adoption agency where 90% of our kids are physically and sexually abused, including infants coming through the court system, where sometimes we can't have visitation, how do you then foster entitlement? Because these would not be relatives like other extended relatives visiting. How do
Okay.
you foster entitlement?
Well, again, what we're trying to do with families, number one is make the family aware of it. They need to know the terminology or the jargon, if you will, and they need to have concrete examples of what entitlement looks like and feels like and what it doesn't look like and feel like. And so as I am working with people, I can sense if they are nervous, if they are unprepared around the issues. For instance, if a family says to me that it's okay for their child to have a reunion when they're 18 years of age, and that will fulfill the child's needs, or they will say it's okay for the child at 18 if they want a meeting for them to do it, I will say, is it okay then for your child maybe to meet with grandparents when they're 18? Would you deny the child access to grandparents early on? And people say, well, no, of course not. They're family. So if the family isn't part of this, the work to be done then is to take the families that you're working with who are not going to know the birth family and to get them used to the concept of this. And part of the work needs to be, again, around the basic building block of doing the grief work, which means they need to let go of that fantasy child, that wonderful child that they're not going to give birth to. Okay? The other issue is around fear. And when you see families that are nervous and not very open and not willing to look at a lot of these issues, you generally know that you have fear and that you have work to do. I find that if a family, and this particular family that is not going to know the birth family, at least the birth mother at this point, I have introduced them to other birth mothers. I have given them lots of literature to read. I have given them examples. I have tried to prepare them ahead of time for what a reunion might be, and that it can be a wonderful journey. And to get them used to this. Very often these families, if you mention reunion, you know, you have bells that go off. And somebody will get misty-eyed, and you know that they're not going to be moving comfortably into that when their child may or may not decide to do it. And again, part of the issue that comes up in this is control. And so one of the things we are seeing, at least that I have seen in adoption, is that adoption is made for codependency. And I know you have heard this word over and over again, and that there are many wonderful people out there speaking nationally about it. But because of the shame and secrecy, we are set up. I recall a conference a couple of years ago in which two women on a blackboard wrote all of the traits of an alcoholic family, codependent traits. And then they listed the same traits in an adoptive family, and there was a match. You see, so we're set up for this unless we do the work ahead of time. And the work can be painful, and it can be uncomfortable. And if the family isn't ready to do it, they may not be ready to adopt. And that can be a real problem issue in the work that I do. Because my adoptions are 97% cooperative, I tend to attract a certain kind of family that truly is ready to go ahead and have a great deal of comfortable contact with the birth parent. Now, one of the questions that I hear in the process, and I find it very offensive, is what do you do if the birth family is dysfunctional? We seem to focus on that. And in my experience, I don't see any more birth families that are dysfunctional here proportionately than we see adoptive families over here that are dysfunctional. And I remember speaking one time in Arizona to the agencies, and one of the agency people said, Ellen, we could never do an open adoption in our agency because of all the loonies we deal with. And I said, well, are you talking about your birth families or your adoptive families? And he laughed. But I thought that that was a very telling statement around his view of birth parents. And one of the things I didn't do earlier, and I would love to see, how many in the room are adoptees first? Oh, so we have quite a few. And how many are adoptive parents? We have a lot, okay? How about professional clinicians? I think some of us wear a lot of hats. And how about birth parents? And we have fewer. Good, good, good balanced group. Now, the next issue I want to look at around this is, in my experience, when a family doesn't develop a good sense of entitlement, what happens? I believe that attachment is impaired. And my belief system is that that is why the attachment clinics are filled, overflowing with adoptees. One of the things that I hear from adoptees who will come to me, although I'm not a part of the search movement, they will come to me for information. And the most common statement that I hear is that they will say, Ellen, I never felt like I was quite a part of the family. I mean, I never felt quite connected. I mean, I look like them, but I don't know what that was about, but I just don't know how to say it to you. And in my experience, that is an attachment issue that goes back to entitlement. Then when I see the adoptive family and begin talking with them about the upcoming search, there are many signs and signals that the entitlement indeed has not been there, because they're sure that that adoptee is going off into the sunset with that birth father or birth mother once the search is completed. So let me go over this. The 3 steps that I give people in bonding and developing feelings of entitlement. Number 1, prepare the nursery and enjoy it. Go in there, sit there, and enjoy what you've done. Involvement with the baby at birth, and most of the people that I work with are at the hospital or in the delivery room for the birth. Number 3 is verbal and nonverbal communication in front of family members, things like sending out announcements or having your friends come in to help you. And I find that all of this helps take people out of what? Adoption's traditional shame-basing. The things which enhance bonding and entitlement, in my opinion, are feeling that you have a right to the child. Not an ownership right, however. Commitment to the adoptive relationship. And as I was writing this, I thought of actress Joan Crawford, who had I believe, a 15-year-old adopted son that at that age she no longer saw. He was difficult, so she gave up. So a commitment to the relationship. Number 3, I think it's important that people have, and again, this is a basic building block, a good, strong self-concept as they're in this process. Number 4, a psychological pregnancy as people are getting ready. And I emphasize ritual, and this is something we're not seeing very much of in the adoption movement, and that is a lot of good ritual. Again, we've been so shame-based that we've always put so much of this in the closet. And number 5, I think this is so important, and I mentioned it earlier, and that is where you develop empathy about the child and their past. And the empathy is such a key issue. And I know Chris Probasco is speaking around adopting at different points in the grieving process. And we know that if you adopt in anger, you will raise the child in anger. And so you will not be able to get into those empathetic feelings. And this is something that I hear over and over again in the workshops from adoptees who have done searches. In the last workshop I was in, an adoptee said, I've done the search, I have this relationship with my birth family, and because my mother cried once for a week, she doesn't know about this. So the self dies in a way. So empathy is a key issue that I try to work with people on as they're going through the process. Are there any questions so far? Yes?
I'm still not clear on the difference between entitlement and ownership.
Okay. Okay, well let me back up.
I've seen such wrong entitlement. I had my son's adopted parents shoved entitlement down his throat. And to me, it came across as big letters, ownership, you know. It was so blatant. That's what it looked like to me.
Okay, entitlement does not have control. The adoptee is allowed to be themselves. They're allowed to have feelings. They're allowed to say, I want to do a search, it's important to me, or I'm feeling really sad right now. My daughter, one of my daughters recently on a walk said, and she's 10, she said, I've been thinking a lot about my birth father. And it was wonderful. We had a marvelous conversation, but I know that she was able to say that because of the safety provided. And so I would put out to all of you that it's so important that we provide the safety for that other person to be themselves. And if you're in a controlling mode, that is not entitlement. And there are people who feel entitled to parent. I have a checkbook, I can write out a check, and I'm entitled to have a baby because it's what I want. I'm needy and I'm empty inside, and if I have that baby, I'm not going to be so needy and empty. That's not the kind of entitlement I'm referring to.
Another thing that I feel or sense so strongly in this area, in this particular home, is, boy, I really don't know how quite to say this, but to me, it seems like the problem in getting the communication, there's a big problem in getting that communication between the adoptive parent and the adoptee because he really knows it's a lie. How do you, where is the truth and where is the lie in entitlement?
I don't think ownership, this is really confusing. Entitlement is a very difficult concept to explain. But
Yes.
ownership, though, is not limited to adoptive parents. Biological parents have the sense of ownership also. In other words, viewing their children as possession. So that's the only one, that's the way that I begin in order to develop that explanation of what entitlement is. So that seems to help a little bit, because entitlement and ownership are two different things.
I don't know if I'm
Okay.
I don't know if I'm fitting all my thoughts in with this. Here's an example, maybe to help. He has been told, drilled on who he is. It's an identity thing. This is who you are. You are our child. This is your family name. And here you are on our family tree. There's your name. You're our son. Son.
Oh, and
It's not the name, it's son. It seems like more like ownership.
It is ownership. What you're describing is ownership. And I think, again, I can give you a family tree example that one of my 10-year-olds last year did a family tree in school. And this half of the family tree had us, and this half of the family tree had the birth family. And that felt wonderful to me. And it was what she chose to do, because that is how she sees it, is that she has all of these family members. So I don't, at least for me, and I don't know about the rest of you, you're not describing a family who is in the entitlement mode. They are in the ownership mode. And to back up what you have said, yes, there are many, many families who do feel they own their children and manipulate accordingly. We have seen it as something, however, that is rampant in adoption and something that hasn't been worked with. Yes?
I work in Utah for the Office of Social Services, and I specifically work in foster care. I see a lot of failed adoptions. You know, the parents will say, you know, we can't handle them. They bring them to our agency and we stick them in foster care. And it seems to me like one of the issues, especially in Utah, is the fact that the Mormon Church, you know, takes the position that once the parents take the baby or the child through the temple, the child's theirs for all time and eternity. So you'll get these kids who will go through their teenage years, and it's like they'll say, "That's taken away for all time and eternity," because they really do believe in the principles that the LDS leaders teach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just more than they can handle, because they know that, you know, it's drummed into them that they're owned, and you know that's the philosophy of the church.
Well, what this does is that this is able to foster, and I certainly see it with adoptees, the denial system by getting into this particular mode, because the average child is, or even young adult, is not going to question and is not going to do a search, because the loyalty issues are overpowering when you're in this mode. And I had dinner last night with an adoptee who was telling me that it's only been in the last year that she began to break her denial, that she would always tell you, I had a wonderful childhood and a wonderful family, and I knew enough about my adoption. And now that she has broken denial, the pain and the memories also with the pain have begun to come up. And as she has spoken to her adoptive family about these issues, she realizes that she doesn't have the safety to share with them her search. So that would again be the ownership mode. Yes?
I'm an adoptee, and one of the issues that I felt when I was growing up, that my parents, if they were here, would say, "Oh, but that's impossible, how could you feel that way?" I never felt I belonged. Now, I'm not sure exactly where that stems. It may be because my brother was so hostile. My adopted brother was very hostile to me, and I never felt wanted by him. But my parents made a big deal about showing family photographs, and, you know, this is who you are, and I think they saw it as this is the way we include you.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it as only showing out how I was different, that I didn't have that nose, and I didn't have those eyes, and I didn't have that color, and whatever, and it wasn't something that I was able to verbalize, and it wasn't something that I thought bothered me, but I'm wondering whether they're thinking, you know, their process of trying to make me feel belonged, or, you know, a part of, by including me in all these photographs and all this kind of stuff, had the opposite effect to me. That, you know, it actually made me feel like I didn't belong, and that, you know, that I wasn't a part of them. I'm just wondering whether the signals can get mixed all the time. You know, here you think parents are being entitling when in fact they're being owning, and where, you know, I'm having a lot of trouble with terminology.
Well, that's one reason why the conference title, Sharpening the Focus, is so wonderful, because as people are speaking and bringing forth information, we are learning that there are better ways to do all of this. And we know that there are some answers to some questions that we haven't looked at before. We also know that there is no quick fix in adoption. And that is one of the biggest problems that I am seeing in open adoption, is the fast track, quick fix. And one of the terms I'm using now that addresses this particular issue, and although this is not on the bibliography, I highly recommend this. This has nothing to do with adoption. It's called the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It is a brilliant bestseller. And it uses a term that, in fact, applies to what we're doing in the American Adoption Congress. And the term is called paradigm shift. And some of you know this term. This first came forth in scientific work. And he gives a wonderful example that when Albert Einstein developed the theory of relativity and went way beyond where people thought that they could not go, that a paradigm shift took place overnight in the scientific community. When Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, a paradigm shift took place, and the following year a number of people were able to break the 4-minute mile. What I propose to my clients is that they embrace the concept as they come in frightened, not knowing how far they're going to go in the process, and I tell everybody the paradigm shift will take place in you too. And I will give you what you need to be able to do things in a way that we believe now are appropriate in raising these children and in addressing the issues that the child has 2 families and needs to have that continuity as well as access to the family. So I think your family and many others have operated in a way in their time that they really felt was best. And I know when I have heard some of the speakers talk about doing adoption 30 years ago and the way it was done, I remember Annette Barron saying we would take these little babies and find nice families, and that was as far as we needed to go. Sharon Kaplan tells a story of shipping Indian children to New York because you could not place them in Arizona. And she jokes that she has an Indian child in a Jewish family whose name is Geronimo Silverstein or Finkelstein, placed somewhere. And that was as far as we were going way back when. Now we know that it's important to resolve infertility issues. We have a national group to support this, to bring people out of their shame. We have therapists doing the adoption work. We have people who are writing about issues such as entitlement and open adoption, and the quick fix is not going to work long term. Yes?
I just, as a family therapist, I just want to say also that that's, just to take it a little bit further, but that's really what's happening in our whole culture in terms of parenting, in terms of family. And I think, it's really important as this work is done here, it's going to all come together, and I think we're going to probably have much healthier people and families and children.
Let's hope so. Yes, you've had your hand up.
From a therapist point of view also, I'm seeing a lot of families coming in with acting out preschoolers, and I'm wondering what entitlement issues I might be looking for in terms of 3- and 4-year-olds that are adopted and having difficulties in this area. What that might look like in terms of behavior from a preschooler.
Well, the first thing I ask people to look for in talking to the adoptive family is to find out how they view the birth family. Find out what the comfort zone is and try to detect what their fears are around the issue. If you find a family that's not particularly relaxed, that has a lot of fears and a lot of ifs, ands, or buts.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
And that entitlement and needs to be addressed. one of the things I tell the people I work with, and you think about this, is that I believe that in family systems we have psychic energy. So I believe that if the parents are fearful, that the child will integrate that into their system. And I'll give you the example. Have you ever been around anybody who was really angry and you walked up to them and said, "Gosh, what's wrong?" And they said, "Nothing." You got it psychically. Or have you been around anybody who is just upset about a tremendous loss in their life, and you might say to them, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" And they'll say, "Oh, I'm really just fine." And you know psychically with that energy that they're not. Children who live with you work more around what you're feeling, I think, than what you're saying. Your body language will give you away. And so I believe very often that when these children are acting out, that they are seeing the facade that the parents are presenting. They're in the home with them every day. So what I try to do as I'm working with people is make sure that they have reading material, tapes, entitlement versus ownership, some of the video material that is out on adoption. Try to really make sure that there is a dialogue and a flow going back and forth as I'm moving them into this paradigm shift. And I absolutely know that it can be done, and with people who have a good sense of self, a good self-concept, that you can do wonders with them and that they will embrace this material. I see it over and over again every single day. Does that answer your question and help you? Okay. Yes?
What about people that are so afraid? I have a couple that I'm working with that they have a probably 6 or 7 week old baby in their home right now. They have a great relationship with the birth mother. Since she was 2 months old, they came to us already together. We have done classes with them. We've done everything we possibly can. But this adopted mother is so afraid to let that birth mom come and see the baby. I mean, I'm an adoptive mom, and I have 2 birth mothers that I hang out with all the time. And I've tried so hard to show her that it's okay and that you can do this. I don't know what else to do there.
Well,
how do you deal with those people that are just so afraid?
That are
it's consuming her life.
Yes. Well, again, in my experiences, this is an unresolved infertility issue that has not been dealt with. So again, we're back to a basic building block. And what I do with people that are in this particular posture ahead of time is say, I don't think that you're ready. This is what I'm seeing. And let's go over the grieving process. You tell me where you think you are. And in my experience, if you can't describe it, you haven't done it. So an example would be a birth mother that called me one time to tell me that she was very much at peace with a placement of whatever 15 years before, and she was calling me about some book information and seemed very light. And I said, well, did you give birth to a boy or girl? She said, well, I don't know. I never saw the child. And I said, well, how do you think that affected you afterwards? And she said, oh, it's just fine. And I said, well, tell me about the grieving process. What did you go through? Can you kind of describe it so that I'll understand how you got to be so happy? And she could not describe it. She said, well, you know, I was sad for, well, probably a couple weeks, well, maybe a month, and, you know, I just put it behind me. You see, there's your denial talking. And again, when I find somebody that is so fearful they have more homework to do, and I address it directly and lay it out, and then we start talking about it, and then that requires that they go forth and do the feeling work, the sad work, the difficult work, the lonely work. Grieving is not sanctioned in our society. It's not fun. There's another approach I use. Yes?
If the can't be described hasn't been completed or felt, then what do couples who have completed in grieving their infertility, how do they describe it?
Okay. One of the things we know, and I will address the wonderful tape, Sharon Kaplan's work, Deborah Silverstein, the 7 core issues, and that is that we know in the triad we all come from a loss perspective. We also know that the piece around grieving is never fully completed, that there will be times for each of us, if we're infertile, if we have placed a child, or if we are an adoptee, where we will feel incredible longing and sadness that will come to us. So I do not tell people that you are going to totally resolve the grieving process. I tell people it will be, you'll do the bulk of the work over here, and then pieces will come up for you. And that I give you permission to do that, and to please call me, and to please share what is going on when it comes up. See, one of the things is that we have so much shame around these feelings that sometimes we're afraid to let them come up. And so we don't share what is going on with others. And I work very hard with people to keep them out of the shame bind. The guilt is easy to deal with. It's the shame bind that I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm flawed, I'm defective.
So you're going for honesty?
Oh gosh, a little honesty, little integrity, yes. Again, we're back to another basic building block, principles, how you base your life in an ethical way. And it's not about the quick fix. So when people have these feelings, I always know if they've done the bulk of the work, and I know Jim Gritter is doing cooperative adoptions. In my experience, they are able to move into the cooperative adoptions with a lot of comfort. And they genuinely have this in the heart in terms of dealing with the birth family. And it's easy to recognize. When they get stuck, it's also easy to recognize. And I have one family right now in North Carolina who have said in our community, having a real cooperative adoption would not be a good idea because what would the neighbors, etc., think? And so I knew that they were stuck and that there was some work to do. Now they have said, in working with a couple of birth parents, that there is one that they just love and adore, and they love having her over, and they're having such a good time. There is an entire shift in the way that the family feels to me on the telephone and also in their letters. And I can feel it going from here, finally, down to here. For some families, it's going to take longer than others, and it's going to be more difficult. Families who do not have good cooperation or trust in their lives may not be good candidates for this kind of a situation. And that's also the other thing that that I look at when I'm dealing with people.
What about when infertility is not an issue? They are not adopted because they're infertile. How do you deal with?
You're talking about preferential adopters? Well, in other words, people that can give birth that choose not to.
No, people who have kids and are coming to adopt. Perhaps a little bit older child, toddlers, special needs kids.
These families still have issues to deal with. They are called preferential adopters in many areas. And again, they are not giving birth to what might have been a fantasy child. And sometimes I'll see a family with, say, 3 boys that they've given birth to and they want a girl. Okay, that would be one example. Even these families have got to acknowledge that the adoptive family is different, and that there is going to be grief work that needs to be done. And they are going to have to work with the issues as well as the issues of entitlement.
What would you see as signs of entitlement in families like that? Or where they have, you know, either all kids of both sexes, but they're coming for an older child or special
Sure. Well, again, whenever I see families that deal comfortably with birth parents where they're not controlling and possessive, and the adoption feelings are genuinely in the heart, then I know that the family has done much of the required work around entitlement. Does that answer that question? Okay. Yes?
I'm thinking, you know, just to, as I personalize this, my family, my adoptive parents just have, they always say, oh, no, it's fine, we understand your need to search.
Mm-hmm.
And then they say, but you don't really want to find out their identities, though. I mean, you just want to get information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I say, no, you know, my father kind of goes, oh, he doesn't want to talk about it. But how do you get, I mean, a family, and when my parents adopted, my brother and I, it was closed adoption, my father said. You know, we were told you'd never find any information out, that would, you know.
Confidentiality.
How do you, I mean, and
Sure.
I really think my parents have this idea of it's their ownership, right to ownership mentality. And so if you can get the entitlement mentality working in a positive way before the adoption, that's the optimum situation.
Sure.
How do you
After the
work
fact.
on it
Okay,
after the
okay.
fact?
That's a good question. The question is, how do you work with families in reunion situations around the entitlement issue? And these are families who thought that they would have confidentiality, okay? I'll give you a couple of examples. A birth mother at a conference, a regional conference, came to me asking if I would facilitate and send a letter to the adoptive family telling them that she had an album for the birth daughter and she wanted to send a birthday gift, and basically laying out what she would like to do, but that she didn't want to interfere. And the adoptee in question was 16 years of age. I went ahead and wrote to the family, who lived in Albany, New York, and explained the situation. The family wrote back threatening legal action, saying that they had been promised confidentiality. They did say that the teenager was healthy, she was happy, she had no need to know anything at any age, and to please not contact them again. The birth mother decided about 6 months after this to go ahead and send a birthday gift to her birth daughter. And someone delivered it to the young lady at school. She then went home and told her parents, who confessed in turn that they had 2 letters from me around this situation, and she asked to see them. When she saw them, she was furious. Again, the honesty versus dishonesty issue. And she said that what they had a copy of what they had written me, that was not true, and that she absolutely wanted the pictures, the information, and indeed wanted a visit from her birth mother. The family then called me, and I referred them to the agency where the placement had taken place. The agency said, we do not do post-adoption services. Go somewhere else. And so they began looking for services that would fill their needs. They were frantic as people, anybody that you can imagine, that there was an intrusion here and that indeed they were going to lose the daughter. Now, the 16-year-old, in my opinion, was what I would call a Mack truck. She had a very strong personality, to say the least. And she got on the phone to me and she orchestrated what she wanted and needed. I believe part of the reason that she was a Mack truck was because she had been so controlled, that she went the other way with the power. and ran with it. I always see, and I think a few of you have seen this, when there's a lot of control and a kid is, it's like a pressure cooker and no steam gets out, we'll go the other way when there's an opportunity. And this thing blew up.
What's finally?
Well, Phil, it worked out really well. The birth mother and the teenager had a very successful reunion. The birth mother was a member of CUB. She had done a lot of work around all of this. The parents were very distant, very upset. However, they stayed connected to me on the telephone. They stayed connected in therapy. The agency they were with in therapy did not address the issue of entitlement, so I did it in letter and on the telephone. After a year, they finally corresponded with the birth mother, and things began to fall into place, which they needed to, because when their daughter graduated from high school, she got herself on an airplane to go live with her birth mother for the summer and get to know her. And so the confrontation in this case was very helpful. The crisis produced some very healthy changes and some very intimate dialogue. Now, I know that there are many adoptees who confront families where they find themselves out the door, the conditional love is there, and that's real scary to test in a family system. But in this case, and in several others that I've worked with in these reunions, once a family was able to integrate the concept of entitlement and work with it, work with their shame-basing, work with their control issues, work with the honesty issues, work with their fear issues, and again, naming what the issues are. What are you feeling? I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling fearful. I'm feeling terrified. I'm feeling awful. I want to die. Ray.
I think we have to face the fact that some of the destruction and damage that's been done by closed adoptions, that we are not going to be able to fix that. Like I think
That's correct.
Your parents, for example, I mean, it's very sad, but like I think they feel a sense of betrayal, and agencies and social workers have been a part of that. And people may, like therapists and so on, Ellen, may not have access to your parents to help them deal with that. I mean, the sense of betrayal is so great that, I mean, they're just close to that. So I think we have to recognize that some of the destruction that our adoption system has wrought, I mean, all the king's horses and all the king's men, we are not going to be able to repair some of that. And unfortunately, there often, I think, adoptees are stuck in the middle of that in terms of loyalty issues, this need to know, but knowing that your parents are going to feel hurt by that, I mean, it's very, very difficult for adoptees. I mean,
Adoptees who have any gumption don't tell them.
Pardon?
I say adoptees who have any gumption don't tell their folks.
Well, that's not very simple, though, because then if you don't tell, you have a sense that you're doing something wrong.
Yes.
I mean, I agree.
Not if you're goofy.
What?
If you've got parents who grew up in the 40s and the 50s when this whole thing was part of the deal, it's too bad. You just let them alone. They'll die eventually.
Well, but I think for a number of adoptees, it's simply not that easy, because you have a sense that you're doing, and if you know that your parents disapprove of that, and I'm talking about not only issues of adoption, all of us, if you look at children that grow up in alcoholic families, that shame and so on, there's still a sense of family loyalty there. And it isn't possible just to go and tell them. I mean, I agree that sometimes the one way of dealing with it is not to tell, because you know it would be so painful for them. But that's still difficult, I think, for the adoptee. I mean, that may be the least difficult choice, but it's still difficult for people to do that.
You're dealing again with secrecy when you don't tell. Sometimes you can't tell, and I realize that. But you're there again setting up that secrecy that you're trying to avoid by not telling.
I mean, I guess basically what I'm trying to say in a rather awkward way is that while reunions are very, very positive, it is not going to resolve all of the other losses and so on as a result of that.
That is correct. Yeah. Well, you know, when you, and I've also, I should tell you, been involved in, I didn't announce this earlier, a number of reunions myself, and I'll give you a little bit of background on them. I'm certainly in a position to understand the loss issues. I had a reunion with my own birth father, and this was through a step-parent adoption placement when I was 21, and he was as dysfunctional as you could possibly be. He was a type of person that you don't admit that you know them. And when he died 2 days before Christmas in 1986, it took 4.5 months of constant work of 4 women to clear out the yard and the house, which had pathways in it. And there were many strange things, 5 social security numbers, and he had been in the Army, and there was a Navy uniform with full identification with his name on it. And he died 2 days before Christmas in 1986. The next day, I got a letter from my oldest daughter's birth mother. Now remember, my adoptions had been closed, and I had not dealt with the entitlement issue. But at this point had been wooing, sending letters, pictures, gifts, and doing everything I could to bring them into our lives. I believe that we had a high-risk child, and I wanted her birth family in our life. She needed that integration. And a letter arrived from her birth mother, and I sat down and cried and gave thanks for that, and that was the beginning there. The day after Christmas, the phone rang, and my husband, I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "It's my son." And I knew he didn't mean his son. It was his 20-year-old birth son who had done a search, and although we had filed everything with the agency, Catholic Social Services in Des Moines, he had done a search without knowing that a waiver of confidentiality had been signed and that there was a thick-inch file from us telling him about us. John had married the birth mother, and there were 2 more children. And I said, "This boy has to look like you, and he's got to be very, very bright." And we flew him out a week later for the reunion, and found that he had been placed in a wonderful family that divorced, quote unquote, when he was 2. And he had been raised on a poverty level. And there was not money for college, although he was a National Merit Scholarship winner, among other things. So we made a commitment and put him through college. And he graduated in June with a 3.9 something. And that was our first reunion. A couple of days after that, we then heard from my middle daughter's birth mother, who said she was ready for a visit. And this is the young woman who visited with the shaking knees when my daughter was 10 weeks old. And so in the space of that week, I had a birth parent die, and we moved into 3 cooperative adoptions in our family. What is interesting about this is that I was busy teaching this in my service and working with it, and I'm ashamed to say I did not have it in my own family. But we took off from there, and it has been a wonderful experience. And I knew that my sense of entitlement was in place one day when visiting my oldest daughter's birth family. We had been there for the weekend, we were leaving, and Kathy came out with 3 cans of soda. And it's evening, and I had a 2.5-hour drive. So I looked at the cans of soda and said, "Gosh, no soda." Took them and gave them to her husband. With that, my youngest daughter had a tantrum, fell onto the floor in front of grandparents and relatives, and began kicking the coffee table. And I knew my sense of entitlement was right where it needed to be, because I did not feel ashamed, embarrassed, or out of it. Now, my daughter's birth mother said, "Gosh, I'm sorry." I said, "Don't worry about it. It's no big deal, but it's a long drive. I don't want to stop. I don't want the soda on the car seat, and I don't want the sugar high." And for me, that was the beginning to test and work with my own entitlement issues. So as we were going along, as family and having interaction, we were then able to see a lot of growth. After the first reunion with my middle daughter's birth mother, she said, "Ellen, this has been such a wonderful experience." She said, "My healing began with this openness." And she said, "I want to call Tori's birth mother and tell her how wonderful it is, so she'll be in your life just as much." And our relationship has continued on that manner. It is loving, it is in the heart, they are extended family. Recently, my daughter's birth mother said, "You know, Ellen, if Tori died, I would still love you dearly and want to see you." And I said, "I feel the same way." Our relationship has gone beyond the adoption placement. And I believe that that's a gift that you can give to each adopted child, is to give them the roots in that by doing your homework ahead of time. And so on the entitlement issue, it is esoteric, as Sharon Kaplan has said, but there are lots of ways to look at it and to test it. I'd like to say something about codependency. I've done a lot of work on this and done workshops around this particular issue. Codependence Anonymous is the fastest growing 12-step program in the United States today. And when I first began going to AA meetings and incest survivor meetings, I was doing it from a clinical standpoint. I wanted to learn more, how to refer birth parents, how to give them better services around issues that I really wasn't qualified to deal with. When I stumbled into a CODA meeting, it was as a clinician looking at other people and their problems. And I found that many of the issues that were coming up pertained to me and my adoptive family. And I found that I had a lot of work to do about my shame basing, about being adopted myself in a step-parent adoption, that I had internalized. I had become the shame, as John Bradshaw might say. And so I began talking to people about shaming issues, about controlling issues. One of the things that I like to do with an adoptive family is to get them to the point that when a baby's going to be born, they are able to let go of those controlling issues. And they are able to say, if that birth parent chooses to keep the child, it is all right. That's a key piece that I like to hear. And that is validation that the birth parent has a right to change their mind and that they may choose to. If a family goes into a situation where they are grabby and needy around this, again, they have more work to do. And so you bring them back to the table, you bring them back to the books. Again, families that feel entitled are more centered. And they are able to let go if a particular situation is not going to be for them. They know then that they need to go do the grieving work. They know then that they need to move forth once that work is done to move into another situation, and that it's not something you quickly do. I can remember one family one time with a facilitator who lost out on a situation, and within 2 days were presented with another. And I think this is unconscionable in terms of doing the grieving and the homework. The families in my service that have not done well, and again, in the early years, I was not providing this kind of education, are families that have a stuck piece about them. They seem to be set in terms of their tension, in terms of their anger, in terms of their shame basing, and in terms particularly of their control. And as one lady mentioned already, we are seeing children who are developing problems at age 3 or 4 around this issue. Are there any questions right now? Yes, Ellen.
Are you seeing any evidence in many members, where for one reason or another, the birth families or the birth mother, if she's the only one involved, are moving away from the communication and interaction.
That's a wonderful, yes. That's a wonderful question. Let me repeat it because they're going to want it on tape. Ellen is asking, are we seeing birth parents that are moving away from the cooperative adoptions? In my service, I would say yes, I do see some of that. The number one complaint that I have from families is that birth parents do not keep in touch enough and are not doing enough. And in giving people this training, I find that once they embrace the material, that they are not willing to let go of their birth families. And I am seeing people devise intricate plans to bring birth families into the fold, to go to their state for a vacation, to do what they need to maintain the continuity. And more than ever, when people embrace this, they understand the importance of a birth parent having good, solid counseling and understanding the issues themselves. Now, several birth parents that have placed in my service have come from different areas to be at the conference because they're interested in the material, they're out of the denial, they're out of the shame-basing. And there are some that want less contact, but those are usually, in my experience, the ones who are in a family system that is very controlling. And I know there's one young woman where her mother, and I hate these, orchestrated the adoption. And at the time, which was 4 years ago, the teenager was 16 and now has enormous rage towards her family and has been very, very generous in her feelings and dialogue with me because I was pulling the other way to get her needs met. And her needs were clearly different than what her family's needs were. So what she did was she pulled away because Mom and Dad said, don't talk to that Ellen Roseman Curtis, you know, and don't talk to...
The second part of that question is, what tools can you then give to your adopted families for the children by adoption who are being left with a situation that was somewhat ongoing, if not very ongoing, and now is being lessened or disrupted totally?
Okay.
We have this child by
Okay.
adoption who's...
Okay. The question is, what tools can be given, correct, to the adoptive family who want to hang on to a birth family?
No, what can they do for their child by adoption? For their child who now is being, left is the right word, but the continuity with the birth family is no longer what it was. So I don't know that you deal directly with the children, so what I'm saying is what tools can you give to your adoptive families, meaning the adoptive parents?
Is it to give the children?
For the child.
Help the children who are
Where they're...
not in as much contact as they were, and the contact
Okay.
has been broken.
Gosh, I haven't had this experience, although I have had a couple of birth mothers and fathers die, and that might be similar. Well, again, if the adoptive family has... Ray, did you have a hand up?
It seems to me that's a similar situation to a divorce, custodial kind of situation where one parent kind of leaves. I think you still attempt to be as charitable as possible to the absent parent.
Like situations have changed. And,
yeah. Again, I think you have to be honest. I mean, you know, to say, well, your dad still loves you. I mean, sometimes that's overdone, I think. You have to say, well, I don't know why he doesn't. Sometimes I know that's hurtful for you. And it seems to me in a situation like that, you also hold out some hope that as their circumstances change, maybe they will be more involved in our lives again. I mean, I guess it's important to normalize it in a sense, and then say it doesn't have to do with you, it has to do with the other person. It would be the most important principle of that.
Again, that, I think, to normalize it, and that is a separation issue. It does have to do with the other person, and it does not have to do with you. But I can tell you just quickly, and I think we may be getting close on time. Somebody might give me a high sign. I have several families who have absolutely, and this would be the rule of thumb, if you lose a birth parent, who do you look for? You find someone else in the family for that child. There have got to be grandparents, aunts, uncles, extended family. And that is always a rule of thumb that I give people if they say, well, a birth mother, I have one birth mother in New Mexico who wanders and shows up twice a year, and she is an adoptee herself. She has family that are interested and lovely. My family right now have not seen her. Nobody has seen her for about 14 months, but they have regular contact with Grandma and Grandpa and an uncle, and so that provides the child with some frame of reference. So if you can't have the birth parent, you always, and again, in my opinion, go for a relative and integrate them. And very often they're delighted to truly be a part of the process. I know my daughter recently wrote a poem called Sigh, Sigh, Goodbye. And she, in Merced, California, had not one, but two great-grandmothers. And one of them made her a quilt a couple of years ago, and she has dragged the quilt around everywhere. And Gigi died in November. And I was so surprised when she wrote a poem at school about her feelings with this sigh, sigh, goodbye. It was very simple, but it meant so much to her that she knew Gigi, and that when we would drive up, Gigi would be sitting in front of her apartment complex with little orange rollers in her hair at one of her perennial garage sales with other little ladies. And Tori has that memory. She had Gigi and Grandma Kay, and she's got a grandmother that's, God forbid, my age. You know, but you provide the continuity if you don't have all that you need. Now, in Tori's case, she has indicated she wants to know something about her birth father's family. And when I discussed this with her birth mother recently, she said, well, I'll tell you what, in June when school is out, let's drive to the next town and I'll help you and we'll go to work on this and see who we can pull in, because he's got a real big family. And we'll approach him and take it from there. And so we're going to do this in June because it's something that my daughter has indicated she wants. And I want to do it for her. So the other thing, too, is sometimes birth family members are distant, not because they don't care, but because they have other issues going on in their lives. And I tell adoptive families, be willing to do the work, to do what you need. And I have one family who has just done an enormous search. They traced the birth father. He has been delighted to be in their life. He lives in Hawaii, and they've made a point the last 2 years to go there once a year on vacation and to see him. They now have completed a search for, going the other way, for the birth mother, and have been approaching various family members of hers. She is Asian, she has a lot of shame issues, and so they have laid out a plan, a vision of how to do this, and a positive vision that it's going to be successful. I have another client who contacted, she's in Arizona, they contacted the birth grandparents in Illinois who said, our daughter disappeared, we don't want anything to do with this, we never want to hear from you again, and write down the list. And so my client went on a campaign, it has gone on for 5 years, of sending loving correspondence and saying, we know you're upset, we think about you, our prayers are with you, whatever else my client has chosen to stay. She has been tenacious because she knows that she has a high-risk child who needs some continuity. And finally, a month ago, there was a break. and the family instructed an aunt who was in their town to call and to establish some contact. So that's the other thing I'm telling people is don't give up. If somebody disappears, do some work around it. Does that answer? Is that helpful? I'm pretty pushy. And I find that that works for people if it's done with love. Yes?
I think the other thought I had is that what that touches in me is that issue that adopted children are more vulnerable to loss or rejection or abandonment again, and they need to be protected. And that's that's part of that whole codependency kind of issue that, like that adopted children can't experience normal grief and loss like other kids because they've already had enough. And so all this maneuvering happens about, well, let's not get close to that to the birth parent because maybe the birth parent will move away and then it'll be another loss. And trying to manage and control all of that rather than assuming or believing the child, with support and help has the resources to work through that like they would in any other aspect of their life.
They absolutely do. There's a wonderful book I'd like to recommend too, and that is Claudia Jewett's book on dealing with separation and loss for children. I have found it to be enormously helpful for not only adoptees who are grown adoptive parents who are working with their children as a way of developing that empathy, that caring. I've also found it to be helpful for adoptive parents with their own issues. And I think it's a small book, it's a safe book to read, and I truly believe that it helps raise your consciousness around what is needed for the child. And again, my belief system is that adoption needs to be child-centered, not adult-centered, which means we need to grow, we need to risk, we need to come out of ourselves to see what this child so deserves. Last question. Yes?
Do you cover issues in all this, like talking about pain? Because one of the things that I see so often is that people are working so hard to try and get rid of the pain that they don't say pain's okay. And it's a normal part of life. Not that you have to be stuck in pain all the time, but there's this protectiveness so that we don't have to feel pain.
Absolutely. To me, that is part of the shame basing. And that is that we're ashamed to show that we're hurting and that we're vulnerable. And so I'll give you a very small example. Just before I was leaving, a family called me who were in a very difficult situation in New York, and they said, you know, Ellen, every time we deal with this lawyer, we feel like we're bothering him. We feel shamed. And so what I did was I spent about 20 minutes on the phone with them, 25 minutes, giving them permission to confront the lawyer in letter form in a clean dissertation about how they felt when they called for services. I said, are you paying for services timely? They said, absolutely. And you're not getting what you want and need from the attorney. So I think people, one of the things I find in the process is that we feel that we don't have any power. And I think it's really important to take people and empower them. It's okay to confront the attorney and to say, whenever we deal with you, we feel ashamed. We feel like we cannot tell our truth. Another way to empower a family is when they're dealing with an agency, to be able to go to the agency and to tell the agency what they might want and need out of an adoption, even though the agency is saying, gosh, you know, we don't do that kind of openness.
This concludes this session.